a brief introduction to the history and remains of Roman London. And this is really just to give you a taste of a longer seminar that I'll be presenting on Saturday, which is entitled Underground London, Discovering Relics of Ancient Rome. So before we start talking about ancient London, I thought I would just introduce myself. I am not a native Londoner, although I have lived in London for many, many years. I grew up in Edinburgh and I studied history of art, including lots of ancient history at Glasgow University many, many years ago. I moved to London as soon as I graduated and I worked for a long time in the art world, but more recently, I've gone back to school. I did a master's in classical civilization at the University of London, looking specifically at ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And then that led me to a PhD in which I studied how people in the 18th century viewed ancient Rome. I've been working for Context as a guide, taking people around the city of London, around its museums and art galleries, and some of the places I'm going to be talking about today as well. And I still continue to write and research about both ancient history and also how it's been rediscovered and reinterpreted in the last 400 years or so. So enough about me, let's start talking about London. And here it is as it looks today. It's been my home for, gosh, I guess about 27, 28 years now. And this photograph that you can see here focuses particularly on the part of London that's often referred to as the city, sometimes the square mile. And nowadays, this is really the business and commerce centre of London. You will see in this image a cluster of huge glass and steel towers that now punctuate the skyline. It's a busy place where billion-dollar deals are taking place every single day. But believe it or not, this is also the oldest and most historic part of London. I love taking my guests around this part of the city. And this is where the Romans founded Londinium, as they called it, 2,000 years ago. Now, it may not look like it from a distance, but in fact, plenty of reminders of the Roman history of London do survive in amongst those skyscrapers and busy streets. You just need to know where to look. So this is one version of how London may have looked 1,700 odd years ago. Now, inevitably, in a reconstruction like this, there's a certain amount of conjecture, but we have discovered the remains of enough of London that we can piece together many of its important monuments, and particularly its layout and its footprint as well. So we think London was established by the Romans very soon after they invaded Britain, which was in 43 AD. And this site right by the River Thames would grow over the following centuries, and eventually it would become the capital of the Roman province of Britannia. Now, some people think that London seems to have slightly fallen into a decline in the 300s AD, although there is some argument about that. And the Roman legions have finally left Britain in 410 AD. And very quickly, we'd imagine in the subsequent decades, Roman London fell into decay and the old Roman way of life very rapidly disappeared. So over the following century, countless later Londons were built on top of the remains of Roman London, if you like. As that happened, inevitably, a lot of Roman London was destroyed. The evidence was wiped out. But some of it has survived, particularly the deeper levels that go right back to the beginnings of London. And they would be rediscovered mostly in the last couple of hundred years, but people have been interested in rediscovering the remains of Roman London really ever since the 1600s. So very quickly, let's run through the history of the city before we start looking at the remains that you can visit today. And this image helps us to imagine London before London as I think about it. Now, it's very difficult to know exactly what was here before the Romans arrived in 43 AD, but all the evidence suggests there was not very much. And this is unusual because when mostly, certainly in Britain and other places as well, When Romans founded their new cities, they tended to choose locations that were already centers of power. So in Britain, many of the important Roman towns and cities were built on places that were already large native British Iron Age settlements. But with London, that does not seem to have been the case. What they probably found was, of course, the River Thames, and probably lots of wild areas, forests, marshland. Back then, the River Thames was much wider than it was today, and the surrounding area was very marshy. There would have been maybe some small farm settlements, small communities, but nothing like a big town, and nothing like what London would become thanks to the Romans. So the Roman conquest, as we said, takes place in 43 AD. The Romans were certainly aware of Britain before that. They write about Britain. We know that as he was conquering Gaul, what we would call France, Julius Caesar came to Britain with an army not once but twice, in fact, in 55 and 54 BC. And he wasn't wanting to conquer Britain. I think he just really wanted to show the British who was in charge and that they shouldn't be helping out the people of Gaul. It was, in fact, the later Emperor Claudius who decided that it was time to conquer this mysterious island on the edge of the known world, as the Romans would have seen it. So he sent over across the Channel a huge army. We don't know exactly which legions were involved, but it would have been a sizable force. And they started to conquer Britain. And of course, Britain back then, I should point out, was split into lots of little tribes with local leaders. Some of the local leaders decided they wanted to fight the Romans. They wanted to try to resist. But several of them decided the easiest thing to do was just pledge their loyalty to the Romans and request that they could remain as kind of local puppet kings, if you like. And that's what happened in many areas. The Roman conquest was a success, and as soon as it was clear that the Romans were going to win, Claudius himself came to Britain, to a place called Camalodunum, and there he accepted the surrender of several of the local British chiefs. And in fact, it would be Camalodunum that the Romans chose as their first capital of the new province. So things went fairly well in the first few years, and gradually the Romans consolidated their conquest and marched north and west. But just a few years into this new invasion, things went terribly wrong. So London had started to emerge at this stage, mostly because as you traveled north across Britain, this was the best spot to cross the River Thames to get to Camalodunum. So first of all, they had ferries, and then the Romans built a bridge across the Thames at the site that would then expand to become London. But in 60 or 61 AD, things went terribly wrong. A local ruler called Prasutagus died, and he pledged his loyalty to Rome, and he wanted to demonstrate this. In his will, he offered to split his property half and half between his family and the Emperor Nero. But the local Roman soldiers decided they weren't going to honor this, and they tried to seize all of the lands and the property owned by the late Prasutagus. They then proceeded to assault his daughters and his widow, Queen Boudica. Now, because of this, the furious Boudica rose up and started a rebellion. She marched south with an army, destroying 3 new Roman towns, including the recently emerged Londinium, or London. Not long after this, she was defeated in a battle, but London had been completely razed to the ground. But it would rise from the ashes of what we call the Boudican Revolt, and rise indeed from the ashes again just 60 or so years later, when it was hit by yet another fire. And in its heyday, it was a sizable city. We don't know at what point the Romans moved their capital from Camalodunum, which we now call Colchester, to London. And in fact, there's no definitive evidence that they did. There's no written evidence or inscriptions, but there's various signs that show that it must have been the regional capital, circumstantial evidence, you might say. Quite when that happened, we're not exactly sure, but we know, for example, that the procurator of the province was based here. It was also very heavily manned. So let me just get my PowerPointer up and running here. Down here is a Roman fort, so it's heavily garrisoned, and this huge basilica that was bigger than any other Roman basilica north of the Alps. So clearly it became a very important place. But it would disappear rapidly in the 5th century after the Romans went. And as we said, later on, people built on top of it, and Roman London disappeared from view. However, in more recent centuries, particularly in the last couple of hundred years, as new buildings have been developed, as new sites are being developed, often the remains of Roman London will re-emerge. So you can see on the left here, this is an image from a London newspaper of 1869, the discovery of a beautiful Roman mosaic, which attracted huge crowds. On the right here, we have the development of the Bloomberg Building, which is right in the heart of the city, the European headquarters of Bloomberg. And there too, they called in archaeologists, as they do in the heart of old London. Whenever they develop a site, the archaeologists come and take a look, and often, along with many other things, they will find Roman remains. So that's a potted history of Londinium, or London, as we call it nowadays. Now, for the second part of this live stream, I'm just going to show you a few of the highlights that you can still see today. Remains of Roman London that are open to the public, and that I often take my guests to. So here is a map of the modern city of London. You can see, for example, here is the famous St. Paul's Cathedral. Down here is the Tower of London. This is basically the exact area that I showed you in that photograph right at the start of the seminar. Now, the dotted line here is the old city wall of London. Not surprisingly, after that Boudican attack, the Romans constructed a huge wall around the city to protect it from danger. This is the fort up here in the northwest corner that I pointed out in that earlier photograph as well. And the bridge that was eventually built by the Romans was right here, just a few meters to the east of the current London Bridge. So as you walk around these busy streets, if you keep if you're paying attention, then you might spot the remains. Before you explore London itself, I always suggest to people that they first of all visit the British Museum, which is outside the limits of the Roman city, but which has a gallery dedicated to Roman Britain, and which has many important artifacts in there that were discovered in London dating back to the Roman period. And during the longer seminar, I'll talk more about some of those, but it's a good place to start. Until recently, I always used to recommend to those going in search of Roman London, they should also visit a museum called the Museum of London, which has a wonderful display all about the Roman city. Unfortunately, it has recently closed because it's moving to a new location. So we won't be able to go there until, I think it's 2025, but they will have a wonderful new display there in their new home, I'm sure. But still, I'm going to take you to the Museum of London. This is the big white building on the right here, because right next to it is a really impressive part of Roman London. What you can see, this broken wall, is indeed a segment of the ancient Roman wall of London. Now, as is often the case, this Roman wall was repaired and restored and reused for many, many centuries, even after the Romans left, right through the Roman period, pretty much up through the 1600s until the 18th century. This old Roman wall, with lots of other later additions to it as well, pretty much circled the city of London. So the footprint of the city didn't really change from Roman times. So we think the wall was built around about 200 AD. probably they were thinking about other attacks. There is a piece of written evidence that suggests there maybe was a rebellion in Britain around about 180 AD, but we're not entirely sure about that. So it could be that building their huge wall was a response to a real live threat, if you like. And as you look at the segments of the walls of London, and there are various parts to see dotted all around the city, mostly what you're looking at is a lower section down here that was built by the Romans, and then later parts that were rebuilt in the medieval and the early modern era as well. So it does pop up in some fairly unexpected places. So I love this section, for example, which is right in the heart of a 1960s and 70s housing development called the Barbican. So as you can probably imagine, a lot of London was very badly damaged during the Second World War, particularly during the Blitz. This led to parts of the old wall being exposed, and as they redeveloped London in the subsequent decades, often they built around the old wall in ways that would highlight it as well. And I love the contrast here of a almost 2,000-year-old wall next to these wonderful modernist apartment blocks as well. You can see parts of the wall here. You can see one of the great ancient bastions as well that were added a bit later on to protect it. The best section of Roman wall that you can see in London today is this one, which is right next to the Tower of London on Tower Hill. In fact, it's very close to Tower Hill tube station. So this bit of wall stands an amazing 10 meters tall, but only, well, I say only, the lower 4 meters of it are Roman. And if you look carefully, you can see the structure of this part is quite interesting, because very typically of Roman defensive walls, there's a mixture of stone and red tiles as well. So Kentish ragstone, which is found in a region to the east of London, and they must have brought that in on ships up the Thames. It's kind of quite rough and ready. And so every so often, to strengthen the structure, they would add a layer of red brick, which just kept it straight and level and made it much stronger as well. So these are terracotta tiles, basically like very thin bricks. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these bits of walls have been rediscovered. So during the Blitz, they rediscovered parts of it as well. This part of the wall was rediscovered in the 1800s, when lots of development was taking place in the City of London. And the wall had actually been reused. So old buildings had been built around about it. And when these were taken down for new structures to replace them, the old Roman wall was revealed. And luckily for us, and quite unusually for the 1800s, it was decided to preserve it. Now, just a stone's throw away from this section of the Roman wall, and basically right next to the Tower of London, is a wonderful old historic church, which is called All Hallows by the Tower. It's not one of the prettiest spots today, I'm afraid, because as you can see here, it's right on a busy road junction, but it is a beautiful building. And once you get inside, it's like a haven of peace and quiet. The church is a building with lots of fascinating history. So we know a church was built on this site by the Saxons in the 7th century, and they did reuse old Roman bricks to build part of their church. I'll talk about that in the main seminar as well. This is one of the rare churches that survived the disastrous Great Fire of London in 1666. It was hit by bombs during the Blitz, and then it was restored again. So the church itself is interesting. My favorite part of it is down in the crypt, because if you head down there, there's a small museum containing several Roman artifacts, a wonderful model of Roman London made 100 years ago, so it's not strictly historically accurate, but it's a wonderful piece of craftsmanship. But most interesting of all, hidden in a dark corner of the crypt, you can see this, which amazingly is the floor of a Roman townhouse. So you can see it's made up of tiny terracotta tiles, tesserae, as the Romans called them. And here you can see an area of plaster, which we think was possibly a wall here. And then all of these little tiles, which seem to date back to the late 2nd century. It would have been the floor in one of the more utilitarian rooms of probably a fairly posh London townhouse. Some of the grander rooms may have had fancy decorated mosaics as well, and I'll show you some of those in the main seminar. And interestingly, this is not the only example of a church crypt where you can see Roman floors. Very close by at St. Bride's Church as well, they have a grey tessellated pavement, which is surrounded by Saxon remains down in the medieval crypt. So of course, when they were digging down, even in the medieval period, they often discovered these ancient Roman remains. So here we have the Bloomberg Building. And I think I mentioned this earlier. This is the headquarters of Bloomberg Europe, designed by the famous architect Lord Norman Foster and completed in 2017. It cost an amazing £1 billion. And I think a lot of that money was spent on reconstructing, restoring, and presenting to the public the incredible remains of a Roman temple, which can be seen in the basement of the Bloomberg Building. So the temple was not a new discovery. It was actually first found in the 1950s, 1954, when the site was being redeveloped for the first time after the Blitz. And I found this wonderful video newsreel from the 1950s announcing the discovery of this Roman temple. So hopefully Zoom can be a bit temperamental with videos, but cross our fingers. This just lasts a minute and it's wonderfully evocative of 1950s England. I'm sure you'll agree.
London, in the heart of the city near the Mansion House, an ancient Roman temple dating back to the 2nd century AD has been unearthed, the first of its kind ever discovered in the capital. A visitor to this relic of Roman habitation in London was Sir David Eccles, Minister of Works. He was shown over the site by Mr. W.F. Grimes, Director of the London Museum, who was in charge of excavations. Unfortunately for future generations, the site of the temple, with its beautifully preserved altar, well and other remains, has been scheduled for a modern 14-storey block of offices. But a marble head of the pagan god Mithras and other relics may find a permanent home in the Guildhall Museum.
I love these old newsreels. From the end of that, you might have assumed that the temple was then destroyed, but the good news is somebody decided that it should be saved because it was so incredibly rare and special. So they moved it. They took it apart stone by stone and they moved it to a new location. And this is where I first saw it many years ago when I came to London. And I think it's fair to say it was not the most inspiring reconstruction of the Roman temple. You can just see it here in the shadow of that great concrete building that they put on the site. They put the foundations of the temple on a concrete base of slabs, the kind of things you would expect to see in a garden patio, right next to a busy street. And it was great that they saved it, but it really wasn't a very effective way of presenting these precious ancient remains to visitors. So the good news is when it came to redeveloping the site and getting rid of this rather ugly office block, Bloomberg stepped in and they agreed that they would take the temple apart again, put it in storage for several years, and then reconstruct it very close to its original location, not quite on the same spot where they found it, but pretty close to it, because basically they wanted to preserve the archaeological site. They felt that reconstructing on top of it might damage some of the evidence for future generations. So you can see how this Roman temple has shifted not once, but twice. And the way it has now been presented to visitors really is something quite special. So it's open to the public, it's free. You do have to book in advance. You go on their website, there's a specially designated website where you can reserve tickets. And I often take my context guests here. So what they've done is they have taken the foundations of the temple, they've reconstructed them. They've also reconstructed some of the plasterwork and wood that was destroyed after the initial excavation. And they've created what I would describe as a sound and light show. So you walk into this big dark room, you can sit down or you can stand. And then for 5 minutes, you can enjoy this incredible show. The lights come up, there's mist, you hear the sounds of ancient Roman chanting and people discussing all in Latin. And the idea is that you're listening in on a mysterious ancient ritual in this temple, which is dedicated to the god Mithras. Now, we think this is what the temple looked like in its heyday. It's this building here, very simple, as you can see, and dedicated to this god Mithras, who in fact was a Persian god who was adopted by the Romans. And it was what we call a mystery cult. So those who worship Mithras had to go through a secret initiation ceremony. And it's a bit like an ancient version of Fight Club in the fact that one of the main points was you never discuss with anybody what you went through in this initiation ceremony, or indeed what happened in the worship of Mithras. And they were very good at keeping that secret, which is incredibly frustrating for us today because it means we know almost nothing about the belief system of Mithras or what went on in these temples. What does help us, of course, is the archaeology. So various sculptures were found in this temple. You saw a glimpse of one of them there in that video. It's now in the Museum of London, along with several other artifacts from the temple itself. So it does remain a bit of a mystery, but there are some things we know. Mithras, born from an egg, apparently, was the god who created the cosmos. And also there's an important scene in which he slays a bull in a cave. So often Mithraic temples, as they're called, were underground. This one is slightly sunk into the ground, but it wasn't completely submerged as some of the ones in Rome are, for example. So very quickly, I'm just going to tease you with some details of another site that I'll be talking more about on Saturday, which is found here at 101 Lower Thames Street. Now, this is the kind of office building you would walk past without giving it a second glance, built in the 1980s, redeveloped since then. But down in its basement are the incredible remains of a Roman house and part of a private bathhouse. Now, again, this was discovered quite a while ago. In 1848, they were developing this site to build the old London Coal Exchange. And this, again, was a very exciting discovery. It was featured in the news. This is a photo of it from the London Illustrated News. And this image was accompanied by a short report which said, Roman villa discovered in Lower Thames Street, a discovery of great interest to the London Antiquary, was made on Wednesday week in digging for the foundations of the Coal Exchange, exactly opposite the Billingsgate Market. So using the word villa is not actually correct. I suppose this journalist didn't quite know what he was talking about. A villa is a Roman country house. This was a townhouse. And as I said, it had a private baths. Now, back in London, there were lots of public baths. Of course, bathing in warm water for the Romans is not just about hygiene. It's a key part of Roman culture. So most people would have used the public baths, but some very lucky people in London and all across the Roman Empire had their own private bathhouse. And this is an example of that was excavated, covered up by the new coal exchange, but preserved. And then it was uncovered again when they redeveloped in the 1970s. And just recently, they've started opening this site up to visitors. So I think I'm going to leave it there just to give you that tempting little detail about 101 Lower Thames Street. If you want to see more about it, more about all these sites and lots of the other Roman sites that you can see in London today, then please do join me on Saturday. And also I've got lots of other seminars coming up about ancient Rome and lots of other subjects as well. So look out for those. I hope you found this interesting. I'll hopefully see you again. I'm just going to pass you back to Sekou now, and he will close the seminar for us.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, for a lovely talk, and thank you all for joining us. I just put those links in the chat to the upcoming lecture about this topic, which will be going a little bit more in depth, which again is on Saturday, May 27th at, let me just make sure real quick, 3 p.m. Eastern time. So definitely tune in with us there. And Alan has a lot of other lectures coming up soon as well. So definitely check those out. I know that a bunch of you posted questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions for today's free live stream. So if you want to learn more, definitely join us on Saturday for a deeper dive into the topic. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you again, Alan, for a lovely lecture as always.
Thank you. Bye.